Good evening, friends. We're just going to wait just a moment. Our new friend Danté went to grab a cup of coffee, had a little tickle in his throat. So he's grabbing a drink. He'll be right with us. And we're glad you're all here and really excited about this. And here he comes. Danté, I am doing the welcome to everybody and getting folks to join in. And what I want to do housekeeping wise is let folks know that if you have any questions for Danté, to please post those in the question box or the chat box, and I will watch that and make sure that Neil has those. Let me actually, before we officially get started, just really officially welcome Danté Stewart with us tonight. I'm going to do just a quick introduction and give you a little bit of his background. So here we go. He's pretty humble, by the way. So this is exciting. Danté Stewart is an award-winning writer, speaker, and author of Shoutin in the Fire, an American Epistle, named by Georgia Writers Association as Georgia Writer of the Year, 2022. Memoir by the Center for American Progress as one of the 22 faith leaders to watch in 2022, and by Religion News Service as one of 10 up-and-coming faith influencers. His work has appeared in The Atlantic, New York Times, The Washington Post, Time, ESPN, Oxford American, Sojourners, NPR, CNN, Parents Magazine, and more. He received his BA in Sociology from Clemson University. He is currently studying at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. And so we, on behalf of Palmer, welcome Danté, welcome you with us this evening. We're looking forward to it.
Okay, I don't know what is this sound that is happening on my computer. Hold on, give me
Sounds
one
like people
second.
knocking on your door, ready to visit. Want to visit you.
Give me 1 second.
You're good. Do you want to sign out and then sign back in?
Yes, let me sign out and sign back in.
Okay, you're coming.
You got
right
it.
back.
We're right here. Hey, folks, this is live television. So this is what happens. We are thrilled that he's here with us, and hopefully we'll get everything situated. Hey, Neil, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I haven't gotten
Good.
used to the time change yet. I feel like it's time for bed.
That's right, exactly.
Because it's dark
And,
outside.
We're noticing that Neil's lighting is a little different this evening, and mainly because it's dark
Time change,
outside.
yeah.
And right behind Neil's head is a street lamp in the playground, and
It's working very well.
it
Which is why I had to
it
move
works very
my
well.
computer from where.
That's right. All right. Come on, friend. I can ask everybody to keep the weekend in your prayers. We have the Parish Retreat coming up this weekend. We have a nice group going to Camp Allen. And so we cover your prayers. I think on Friday, it'll be in the 80s. And then on Saturday, it'll be 35 degrees in the morning. So
I'm looking forward to that, frankly.
me too. It's going to be fun. All right. We'll see if he can get him back signed in. Oh, here we go. How you doing? Got your mute on there.
All right, is that better? I had to give my wife the.
That sounds good. Well, that's a good. We all need help, right?
Okay, cool. Sorry about
There you go.
Okay.
Okay.
Awesome.
All right, we're good.
Awesome.
We're good.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to hop off the screen now, and we're going to turn it over to the two of you.
Great.
Cool.
Thank you, Roger.
You're welcome.
Danté, we were talking before we started, you and I was asking you about you're in seminary now, but I didn't realize that, where are you in your studies? I didn't realize that, kind of where you were.
So I'm actually at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. I am doing my work in modern religious thought and experience. So I'm doing my master's in theological studies in modern religious thought and experience, where most of my work is in the academic world, intersects text, theory, and theology. So I particularly center on Black texts, on Black literary traditions, and critical theories, theological studies, and the likes. I like. Sometimes I like to get lost in the world of theory, and doing close reading of text. I think there is something powerful, especially for religious people. We do the same. We do it with the Bible all the time. We go to the Bible and we ask the text questions. We figure out what kind of meaning this text is generating. We try to figure out what is the voice of the text. What is the world behind the text? How can we get inside the text and the text can get inside us? And so for me, I particularly do that work on Black literature, but more particularly on James Baldwin. So my studies, my kind of expertise is on Baldwin. I did my thesis work on Baldwin, wrote my thesis on James Baldwin as theologian. It was actually incredible because I was a unique situation in seminary where even though I'm doing theological studies, my thesis advisor is in the English department. So great. I was able to mix both literary theory and theological studies, but particularly on Black text, because the question I wrestle with in seminary and have been wrestling with for a long time now is if when we come to the Bible, we're able to see the sacredness in the stories of Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel, and those communities can attest to divine revelation being inside of their stories, that when you recognize them and you read them, you're reading the voice of God, and you can find something sacred and beautiful and magical in their stories, then is it possible that that can be true of Black literature as well? And I found that to be the case, whether reading Toni Morrison, whether reading Audre Lorde, or June Jordan, or James Baldwin, that when I listen to them, I hear the voice of the divine calling out to me to be free and to be loved and to be whole.
You know, what you're describing reminds me a little bit of, you see this, especially within the Hebrew Bible, there's a constant reinterpretation of the past to bring meaning into the present. And in a sense, some of your work, part of that process for you personally, or for your community, or the congregations you serve, or people you're talking to, a way kind of continuing that same process of.
Oh yeah. And I think that's the beautiful thing about the Bible is that, I like to say that for many people, the Bible, we hear this all the time, is like basic instructions before leaving earth. And I think that has merit. I think there is an instructive context and reading of the Bible where, there are precepts and principles that through the preaching moment or through the discipleship moment can teach us about how to live a just and loving and liberated life. But I also think, thinking about preaching as well, I love acronyms, that the Bible is also boundless illustrations becoming lived experiences. Right. So before the Bible is ever a book of rules or a book of lessons, it is a book of stories asking us, where do you find yourself in this story? How do you continue that conversation? And how can you continue that conversation in your particular moment? Because I think about right now, in this moment, we need people who wrestle with the Bible, who love the Bible, who can almost restore or maybe even invite the Bible in public, maybe for the first time, as something that can be a public good for people, that isn't a bludgeon for somebody's theological principle about how they want to see the world being reformed or more moral in their idea. But I think that there is something about the stories and the principles and the ideas of the Bible that can be a public good. And I think we need more people in this moment, especially given this American political moment that we find ourselves in, who are willing to say that, you know, I have unlocked myself from certainty, but I have bound myself to seriousness and imagination when it comes to this text.
That's beautiful. Now, so a lot of that's sort of what you're doing now. I want to ask you a few questions about
Oh,
kinda
yeah.
how you got where you were. And I
Oh,
think
yeah.
first of all, this is I think first things first, because I want to go all the way back. As I understand it, you grew up in a small town outside of Columbia, South Carolina, right? And
Oh,
then you later
yes.
you got your undergraduate degree from Clemson. And I need to be upfront with you. I grew up in a bedroom community outside of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I went to Wake Forest. So we have a tiger and a demon deacon in this
Oh,
conversation.
yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
I was a child in the 70s,
Mm.
and I grew up in a world that was, you know, a little bit out in the country, characterized by family life that was centered on the Moravian Church. I remember very well, like, an ecumenical softball league that played games at an old radar base from the Cold War. Everything in the world I grew up in was tobacco fields, and tobacco barns were everywhere. And I very much grew up in a world of black and white people who most of the time spent their lives separately, even though I never attended. Every public school that I ever attended was integrated, unlike my older brother. But that's the world that I grew up in. A lot of that world is different now. But you were a child a couple of decades later. What was the world in which you were raised like in South Carolina?
Yeah. Well, if I can close my eyes and imagine that world, actually, the first thing that comes to mind is my grandma Adela house. It is a house that has a gigantic field. There's a slaughterhouse in the back, the barn that they used to slaughter all the hog and all the chicken and all the everything in there. And it has like old beat down cars in there right now. And there's my grandmother's small house. That's a brick house that has been there for generations, which my family has restored. Now there's this beautiful, big, magnificent tree that is like right behind her house. And there's something about that tree that captivates me. It has no fruit. It's a tree that is barren. It has no fruit, but it is very much alive. It is majestic in that like it is one of the most noticeable things in the yard. And I remember back in the day when we were younger and we would play around the tree, and then our people would sit around the tree and they would trade stories and we would have moments where, you know, we would get together as a family. And they do this now to this day, where they would get on Sundays after church, and somebody would cook, be grilling, and just be having a good time. You know, that was the world that I grew up in, a very intimate, like Black country world where we were dependent on one another, but we also were dependent on the things that grew up from the earth.
Right.
We were dependent on farming and the fields, and dependent on the land and vegetation and all of that. As I think also about my upbringing, I grew up in a very, you know, and my mom and my dad are also babies of the 70s. And during that moment, you have, and I think politically and philosophically, my parents were both babies of Pentecostalism, but they were also babies of the Black Revolution that happened in 69 and 70. And so this Black cultural revolution that gave them a sort of like Black consciousness to say that, like, you know, we as Black people, this country also belongs to us, and our name belongs to us, and the land belongs to us, and we are a part of this country, and we create and we do things that matter and make meaning and shape who we are in this country. We have a destiny in this country that we too are America, and this country is ours. There was that shaped them, but then there was also a sort of like spontaneity of Pentecostalism and expectation that I grew up with that shapes me today. That, like, Danté Stewart is a reflection of a young man who comes from a people who are intimately connected to the earth. So I am very like I have like parts of me that's like, like I'm like a tree hugger type of dude. Like I am very much like take my shoes off and go outside and like sit on my truck, sit on the bed of my truck and burn like some Palo Santo, and just sit out burning wood and smelling the wood. But then also there's a part of me that developed from my upbringing, a very deep love for Black people and deep love for the country and a deep love for the life of the mind and the life of the soul and the life of the spirit, in ways that expects change to happen, that expects something to happen when we show up in the world. And and my world was filled with sports too. So it's like, yeah, I am a sports head. I play football. We were in the gym all the time, so that shaped us as well. All we really had was like, one another. We had church, we had sports, and that was really the three things that made our lives: one another, sports, and church. And so that's my life. That's my upbringing.
You mentioned those Pentecostal roots. Actually, my next door neighbors growing up were Holiness Pentecostal, and they had I never realized this was unusual until I was in college and I came home, and we're like in a regular neighborhood, a little bit out in the country, but like they have a Greyhound bus park behind their house because they would sing. They were a singing family to go around like that.
Oh yeah, I remember that too, bro. I remember we would travel as a church. We would go up to DC and we would travel to Baltimore and Philly and New York and Chicago. And it would be amazing because, for young kids in the South, we rarely got outside of our own town.
So that's an important thing, to be connected to the people in other places.
Right? To dream of like the big city or to see the big city, or to see Black people in another area. Because, before I ever knew the Great Migration was a thing, when we traveled up north to different churches, we were able to have intimate connection with that history, and the ways in which like the South travel all through the country, whether it be through music or whether it be through museums or food
I had a friend in seminary. I went to Yale Divinity School and I had a friend from Minnesota, and he said I'd like you to make something like your mom would make. And I said, well, I'm not a very good cook. And I tried to make something once, and I thought for a little while. I said, you know what? I know what we can do. And I got out in the days of the Yellow Pages. He said, what are you looking for? I said, I'm looking for soul food. And we went and we found a place in New Haven, and that's exactly what he wanted. And I said, I just hadn't really thought about it, but I said, we can get you what you want because of the history of what you were talking about. The travels. Thinking of those roots, those Pentecostal roots, then so some people listening to this conversation are standing in the same spot in the room of Christianity in which they were raised. Others have moved around now and then, sometimes for positive reasons, sometimes for negative reasons. But you have kind of ballroom danced your way all around to many different corners of the room, including the one where largely white American evangelicals hang out. I mean, could you describe your spiritual journey into and out of that part of the room and how that relates to your Black identity? Because that seems really important to your story.
Oh yeah. I mean, it very much is the heart of my story. When people oftentimes ask me to describe what my book is about, I used to, describe it one way, but the older I get, and now the book being a year old now, I realized that it is a story of a young man learning how to become whole and mature through grieving himself, his country, his faith, and what he became. And it is through learning the language of grief that I have learned the language of courage. It is through the language of grief that I've learned the language of liberation and healing. And so when I think about that story, it is at the heart of who I am, the courage to be honest about what I became, but also the courage to reinvent yourself to what you can become. So my journeys into white evangelicalism first started in college, where playing football at Clemson University, usually the people who was in closest proximity to athletes are white conservative evangelicals. And if you really want to, if we really want to be honest, I think college sports is very much in tune, especially in the South, with conservative politics. And you see a lot of, you kind of see a lot of power play moves, on the football field and in the context of the game, speaking metaphorically. And so being in proximity to white evangelicals in this moment came through like Fellowship of Christian Athletes, where we were just kind of finding our way, trying to just be spiritually connected somewhere. Because usually when we leave home, one of the things our parents tell us to do is, find you some friends,
Right.
and find you a church.
Right.
Find you somewhere that's gonna feed you. And for many of us, I don't think we take into account that the places that's feeding us is also robbing us of nourishment. And that's what really happened when it came to white evangelicalism. I came through FCA, where it was just somewhere different. I was just trying something different, but I never realized that, like, as I was trying this different thing and was just going to like worship services with my friends, it was also socializing me into really socializing and discipling me into a tradition of Christianity that erased who I was as a person and the people that I came from. That for many Black folk, we wasn't included, nor were we desired in those spaces. So the preaching was different, the theology was different, the vibe was different. It didn't feel like home, but because it brought with it sort of like access and affirmation, then it felt good to be in that space, because oftentimes we were the first, and when you're the first, you're oftentimes the most affirmed, the most loved, until you do something to get out of that type of good grace. And that for me went on for a long time, all the way up until probably that kind of unraveling happened around the election in 2016. I'll never forget, I was leading a group through a book by a white evangelical man, very popular pastor. And I was leading a home group, a small group, through his book on race. Now, mind you, at this moment, I ain't never read no book on race. I was just like the young, charismatic Black dude that, I could preach, I could teach, I could connect with people. And they wanted me to lead this group. And it was actually through leading this group that I started to realize what this white evangelical space actually took from me. I named the first chapter of my book Wages for a reason, because there's always a cost and there's always a price to pay. The cost of being Black in white evangelical spaces is oftentimes we have to assimilate to make people comfortable so they won't have to deal with what they've been running from the whole time. And the price to pay is that it means that we have to distance ourselves from who we are and what made us, and dislodge ourselves from the people that we came from. And so not only do we give up ourselves for the faith, we give up ourselves for people who oftentimes want to hold on to a morally superior view of themselves. So Martin Luther King, in Where Do We Go From Here, writes that, talks about this idea of the sense of superiority of white Americans in this country, where so many white Americans believe they have so little to learn on race, and oftentimes the reason why many people believe they have so little to learn is because they actually deal with so little. So when you deal with so little and face so little, then you believe, there's very little you have to learn because you already have everything figured out. But it wasn't until the election that I started to realize that I was in a place that turned me into a weapon. It turned me into a weapon that was always used against us, that was always used against our equality and our freedom and our humanity. And when Trump happened, when Philando Castile happened, and Alton Sterling happened, I started to realize that, like, they only like me around because of how how like non-racist I made them look, you know, how good and moral I made them feel by giving them the affirmation that like, because I'm present, it means that we don't have no problems. And that's just not true. When we think about white supremacy, you know, Eddie Glaude does a really great job at this in Democracy in Black, and talking about white supremacy as this kind of superstructure, this system that is not just simply about white men and white hoods, but it is about the value gap, where in this country we believe white Americans are more valuable than others, where their pain matters more than other people's pain, where their rage and their anger matters more than other people's rage. And for me, my journey out was when Trump happened, when Philando and Alton Sterling happened, I had to make a decision as to whether I wanted to continue to be a weapon for whiteness, or whether I wanted to be somebody who was free, who didn't have to give up the best of myself for people who only wanted me for the worst of their politics. I had to make the decision that I refused to run and refused to become, you know, a puppet, or refused to become a kind of, excuse me, refused to become a tool in somebody else's war. And I just got tired of it. And I would like to tell people that, like, then I found James Baldwin. I believe that it's impossible to remain in white evangelical spaces after reading James Baldwin. It's almost impossible.
I'm intrigued by, you know, I could see what you're saying about what you have to give up, what you give up by walking to different spaces. And now thinking about another corner of the room, I was really struck in the mid 1990s. I worked in Virginia for the Episcopal Diocese there, and one of the things I got to do for a while was to travel with the bishop. And I remember I have this really striking memory of going one Sunday to a lovely, you know, small community in the foothills of the mountains. And we got there, and I realized, so we were going to make 2 visits that day. There were 2 churches served by the same white vicar. There was a larger white church, and then there was a smaller black church, and they both had old historic roots there. And like, I remember, and we visited with each congregation, visited with leadership. I remember we visited with one of the oldest members of the black congregation who there was definitely a connection to slavery, like maybe her parents were born in slavery, and she was really, really old. And I remember going to her home, and I remember leaving that community, and I asked the bishop, I said, wow, you know, that was really uncomfortable. Like, why they have the same priest? Why don't we just have one church there? I mean, you could have, a baseball player could certainly have thrown a baseball from one to the other. But he was, and thinking about what people give up, though, and the complexities of untangling knots, he was saying that at least at that time, you know, the hesitancy for simply folding the congregations together came from the black congregation, because they are leaders in their church, their parents were leaders in that church, their grandparents were leaders in that church, and all of that sort of thing. And you know, you could easily fold the 2 congregations together, and then all of a sudden nobody's in leadership. Just, you know what I mean? Like, people would be giving something up by doing that. And it just made me realize how really complicated untangling the knots of a lot of the history that we inherited. There's not always an easy answer. And I'm just wondering what you think when you think about it. Because people lament, people grieve over the fact, you know, of churches being segregated, but it's not like an easy answer as to what's to be done because of that fact.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I think for so many people, like, because white people in this country have not developed a muscle called honesty, like, and courage, like, then every little kind of shakeup in the world of whiteness becomes an 8.0 earthquake.
The reaction.
You know, 100%. And so we as Black people in this country, we have been forced to be honest and courageous, because if we were fearful and not courageous, then we would still be in chains. If we think about this, like if you think about like white supremacy in this country and the inability to have progress, you think about desegregation. And even when desegregation happened, what so many people did not want to give up, people wanted to integrate proximity, but they did not want to dismantle and reorganize power, because the muscle of honesty and courage was not developed, because comfortability was the comfortability was the norm. You know, when you are able to live in a neighborhood and you don't have to deal with anybody else, and that is your norm, then when somebody else comes into that norm and they change that norm and challenge that norm, then you're probably going to respond in backlash, because your empathy muscle is atrophied. And it's like in this country, it's not just a crisis of hatred. It is that as well. Like, it is a crisis of a long hatred in this country of equality and justice, but it is also a crisis of courage, honesty, and empathy. It is a crisis of being able to say that in my honesty, in my courage, in my willingness to face who we are and what we have become, and what this country means for so many people, it's developing that muscle that allows people, whenever the tension happens, to be able to push a little bit more. So it's like working out. Like when people talk about working out, like there's this idea of going to failure. Like, you go to the threshold of where you're breaking down the muscle, and you train yourself just to do a little bit more, because doing a little bit more, you realize that pushing yourself to failure, you allow yourself to get stronger in the process. And I think when you talk about facing history honestly, is that many people in this country have not developed that muscle. And because that muscle is atrophied, then they resort back to comfortability. And I think that's one of the cases of many churches and integration. It's not just the fear of change. It's also the fear of stretching. Mm-hmm. It's the fear of you may not be as strong and as moral and as good as you think you are, and you need a little bit of help. And so,
that sounds like Christianity. We do need a little bit of help. I'm curious about, I don't know, maybe this is a generational thing, but I used to read a lot by the late Peter Gomes, who taught at Harvard Divinity School and was a senior minister of Harvard's Memorial Church. He was an interesting fellow, Black gay minister of the gospel who was a Republican for most of his life. He was an American Baptist who sounded like the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's an interesting guy. And about 15 years ago, he was at a conference at Trinity Church in Wall Street in New York. And he talked at one point how it's instructive to examine how the religion of white slave owners became an instrument of liberation for enslaved Africans, rather than the instrument of docility that the slave owners had hoped that it would be. Mm-hmm. And he said that white Christians could not corrupt the truth of Jesus because, quote, the Christian faith was stronger than the Christians who used it. And I'm wondering if you could respond to that, because I can imagine some people taking a different path and, maybe walking away from Christianity completely after realizing the extent to which forms of it have been weaponized against them. Do you often have conversations with people about that, about whether to stay in the faith that you have chosen to keep?
Yeah, I have conversations with people about that all the time. And so many people are intrigued by my story, particularly because in my book, I am not necessarily like somebody who's trying to wrestle with the question of faith overtly, as much as a narrative of like dismantling and relearning and unlearning and learning again. But it's not a pretty picture. It's a very messy story of faith in my own words. And many people are intrigued to wonder, like, okay, how were you able to hold on to this? And for me, for me, it's simple. Baldwin well, I could talk about Baldwin as well. I want to talk about Baldwin. I want to get to Cone before I get to Baldwin.
Sure.
James Cone has this really good quote that really kind of grounds me, where he says that like that for him, like he had to dismantle like the ways in which like white Christianity erased, the tradition that he came from.
Right.
He had to dismantle it. He had to get rid of the poison disease theology that would say that that we had no theologians, that we had no tradition, that we had none of this, we had none of that. He says, and he had to return back to the tradition that realized that being Black and Christian can be liberating. And so for me, like, I knew that like whatever faith that white evangelical held out for me, it was a faith I couldn't embrace anymore because it refused to see me and embrace the full part of me. Like, white evangelicalism loved me when I talked about Jesus, but didn't love me when I talked about Philando Castile. They loved me when I talked about John Calvin, but they didn't love me when I talked about James Cone. They loved me when I talked about Mary, but they didn't love me when I talked about Black women. They loved me when I talked about unity, but they didn't love me when I talked about justice and liberation. And so for me, when I think about the tradition of Black faith that I come from, I go back to Baldwin and this idea of, he says this in The Fire Next Time, that if the concept of God cannot make us more free, more larger, more loving, then it's time to get rid of it. And I think for me, what Baldwin was saying is not getting rid of God as an idea, but getting rid of toxic theology that wants to make God a white, vengeful judge rather than the God of all people, who is a God of love and liberation. And so for me, that meant that, like, if indeed I come from a tradition of people where I call it the Black sacred imagination, where they take the metaphors of Christianity and they redefine them. There's no way possible to read James Baldwin without seeing the ways that his faith is at the heart of what he's doing, where he says that he has this quote where he says that I conceive of God as a means of liberation and not as a means of controlling others. And he says that whatever idea of Black people in this country, this idea of freedom, it will be in reflection of our ideas of theology and our idea of God and how we understand who God is for us. And so I talk to people all the time where I tell them that, like, I don't ever want to force anyone to say that they have to remain in a faith that for them becomes traumatic. I just don't think that God wants that. I don't think that God wants people to be in relationship with an idea of God that's traumatic. When I look at the Bible, when I look in John 10:10, Jesus says the enemy, the thief, comes to kill, steal, and destroy. But I come that they may have life and life to the full. One cannot have life to the full with the divine if one's idea of the divine is ultimately traumatic. Then that means that if my idea of the divine is anyway toxic and traumatic, as Baldwin would say, I need to get rid of that idea. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at when he says, in many cases, you have heard it said, but I say to you, what he's telling us is not necessarily that you need to throw all of this away, but there are some things we need to unlearn and relearn so that our faith becomes a little bit more loving. And for me, I've made
sale.
Huh?
You can have a little bit of a yard sale.
Oh,
Not
indeed.
Let me ask you about this image. I love this image of these saints that surround you and support you. And I was wondering if you could read just a little bit from the introduction to your book, your memoir, on page 6 and 7. If you have that there. On page 6, beginning, there's a paragraph that begins, I don't know if our country has taken time. And then through all the complete paragraphs on page 7.
Yeah.
Can you read that for us? Because I think this. I would love to hear this in your voice.
I'm going to try my best. I'm actually just getting over the flu.
I'm sorry about that.
Oh, it's cool. 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 All right. Let me get it real quick. Oh, I got it on my phone. So.
Oh, that's okay.
All right. So I'll read
All the way to
that to
I
the
listen on the next page.
cool. I don't know if our country has taken time to look itself in the mirror, to question the ways that keep us up at night and makes it hard to pray. I wonder if the country I love can imagine itself as better than the ways it has learned to be terrible. I fear that the same country that my mama had to live in is the same country my children and theirs will have to live in. As I live and move and have my being in this country, I wonder to myself, how do I be Black and Christian and American? So I return to this old King James Bible and our Black prayers and Black sermons and Black songs and Black poems and all the ways Black folk have learned how to love and live in a country that does not love us. I return because I have so much more to learn about love and how to love in ways that are honest and brutal and beautiful. I return because there is something to be said to me. I don't go to that old Bible, our Black words, or books to convince myself that the terrible things will eventually get better. No, I return because I know that there is something about these words that the old Black country folk held on to in the midst of the burning. One morning last August, my body felt heavy as I slowly made my way downstairs to make my coffee. We had somehow endured yet another summer of violence, this time just with more of the world's attention. The sun crept through my windows. My son was sleeping soundly and my wife was asleep upstairs. I was struck at how ordinary this moment was. The house was still and quiet, yet chaos ravaged my mind, my body all the way down to my feet. A non-raised sadness sat trapped in my body. I didn't feel anything, but I know I must feel everything. I needed a way to think about all the hell that was happening in the country. Numbers that kept climbing, public lynchings, hashtags, eulogies. So I sat at our wooden table, cracked open the dusty Bible to join the cloud of witnesses, to see the ways they hear the crosses, filling every splinter, and to see the ways they were led at night by fire. As I sipped and sat, I listened.
Thank you for that. That especially spoke to me just because most Episcopal churches observed All Saints Sunday last weekend, and we're calling this real connection between us, the saints on earth, and those who've gone before us, the saints in heaven, known and unknown, famous and not so famous. And it's a powerful reality that's given strength to so many Christians through the centuries in times of trial, in times of uncertainty, in times of suffering. And so do you feel that sense of being surrounded by the ancestors, spiritual?
Oh, indeed. Indeed. It's like my back wall, on my back wall.
I see. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
there's your cloud of witnesses, right?
Yeah. I have this new iPad and it follows me wherever I go. So I gotta move my head. So on my and really, I think about my house as an artifact of the people that I come from.
Yeah, right.
I mean, you can't really see it, but on this back table, there's old Jet magazines and Ebony magazines from the 60s and the 50s and the 70s. In front of me, there are anthology and books of art and just anthologies of Black life on this coffee table. Behind me, there's James Cone and Toni Morrison and James Baldwin and Katie Cannon. And on this bookshelf, there's a whole section down at this bottom right here of old Black classics. And I feel like every time I come into this room, I'm almost ushered into a meditative space where I can feel the spirit of people who have gone before me or people that's around me right now. And I feel this intimate connection to something deeper, that the work that I do is deeper than just simply success or failure. The work that I do is deeper than simply, whether it works or not. But I'm a part of something that's grander. I'm a
Greater
part
than
of,
yourself, right?
indeed, I'm a part of almost like, it's almost mythical in a sense. In the
Do.
Greek, in the Greek in the Greek classics. I just got this book on Greek classics. I love like old school stuff. In the Greek classic, there is almost this kind of wondrous relationship between the gods and humanity, where the gods are almost, there's a part of the gods cheering on humans to be the best that they can be, to accomplish the best things that they can accomplish. And I feel that same way with many of the ancestors. I think about the Bible, that is at the heart of the Bible, is the intimate connection to the vision and the values and the mission of the people who come before us. And the question we must ask is, how are we walking in their spirit? And how are we honoring their name? How are we honoring their voice? How are we honoring what they prayed for? And I have a line in the book that we're not just, our ancestors' wildest dreams, but we are also their answered prayer. And any day I wake up with that on my mind, it is becoming that answered prayer again and again each day.
I might come back to that in just a second. But I want to ask you this is from a member of our congregation. Danté, thank you so much for your voice and sharing with us. I am struck most by your chapter called Rage. I am a white man. Am I allowed to participate in Black rage and share your anger at our history and the systems we created in our country that I love? Or do I need to find my own rage?
I think it's both and. I think to participate in rage is just simply to be empathetic. What is empathy but standing in solidarity with the fullness of another person's emotionality? Like what is solidarity but participating in another person's suffering? When we think about the bread and the cup of Jesus, when we take part in that, we take part in the fullness of what Jesus felt, whether Jesus was getting away, in the wilderness, and us having those moments where we get away in the wilderness, or whether Jesus was teaching and embodying that ethic of teacher, or whether Jesus was just simply being the good life of the party. When we participate in the body and the blood of Jesus, we are identifying with the fullness of Jesus' ministry and message in the world. When we participate in the body of other people, when we stand in that together with one another, then we're saying that whatever you fully feel, I want to feel it with you. And so a part of that is solidarity with another person's rage, but then also I think that rage is foundationally about a refusal to be silent about what hurt us. And if we refuse to be silent about what hurts, then that means that each of us must find each of us must find that thing that allow us to not be indifferent to what hurts us and other people. So simply, if one wants to find your rage, then find what we as human beings are silent about as it regards to what hurts us and other people. And I think each of us need to find that, because if we find that, then I think we'll find our voice and place in the world. Many people wonder, what is my place when it comes to like activism? What is my place when it comes to changing the world? And I think it's simple as finding ways to speak what hurts us deeply. And if you can find that, then you can find what it means to be active.
That's really
and work
helpful
on
with that. Yeah.
it.
That's helpful to a lot of people, I think, in my congregation for sure. Going back to that cloud of witnesses and the stories that, that surround you and that you keep alive. In the same way that the Bible itself remembers history, it reinterprets it for the present. As you know, in our political life and our communities, people have been debating history in ways that I never would have imagined would have happened. And I think back to where I grew up in North Carolina, and where I went to church in North Carolina, like generations of my family before me at the same church. I never knew for the vast majority of my life that in that area of North Carolina, that not only the place where I grew up, but even where I went to church, that there was this stronghold of unionism and resistance to the Confederate government throughout the Civil War. And I have a great grandfather who's buried right next to a man who was a founder and leader of a secret unionist society that protected families, that helped deserters, that kept people out of conscription, that did all these things. And my father's buried in this graveyard, surrounded by many of these people, but I never knew that, and I don't think my father ever knew that. And I think what scares me about that is that it's almost as if all those stories got buried with those people in the graveyard, and then later the stories were not told.
Yes.
So the other stories took over, and it is frightening how quickly things can be erased from memory.
Oh, 100%. And I think
just thinking about, how do you think about that, or keeping memory alive?
Oh my God. I'll talk about for white people first, and I'll kind of go to my story. I think that is indeed one of the struggles today, is that for many white Americans, they have the wrong heroes.
Right.
When people think about, the white people who did a lot to change the country, I don't think white people understand or are given the stories and the models of liberation that would actually allow one to practice liberation and embody liberation. I can practice and embody liberation because I have seen it live in another body. I have seen liberation embodied in another person. So when I something as simple as this Baldwin candle, right?
Sure.
When I look at Baldwin, I can see liberation embodied. When I have these images and I have their words, I can hear freedom and love and dignity and spirituality embodied. But for many white Americans in this country, you are kept from that history. That history is superseded by the vast majority of people who indeed, wanted to live out the worst of the country. And so I think that white people need new heroes. They need, because those heroes.
And the good news is you can choose the saints that you want to surround you. You can choose the saints you want to put behind you right there. Right.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And I think there's so much possibility that's wrapped up in having models of liberation and love that we can follow. So like somebody like Thomas Merton, or somebody like Dorothy Day, or somebody like even though he's not white, I think he's definitely not white, Henry Nouwen, or whatnot, models like John Brown, or whoever represented the best of a people, Abraham Joshua Heschel, whoever represented the best of these people, the best of the tradition, to lean into that, to give, young people or old people those stories, to say, if you want to be the best of us, then this is who you should be like. So back to me, in my story, I have that memory preserved. Right. It is literally living in me and around me every day. At any given moment, I can go to a book or an interview or a documentary and be reminded of the people that I come from, and be empowered by that memory, and things like that. At any given moment, I'm reminded of Toni Morrison. She has a really good, I would suggest people read this. It's a beautiful, beautiful lecture. It's called The Sight of Memory. that memory, to keep memory alive, is to imagine, to ponder the actual and to imagine the possible. So that is, in some sense, courage and honesty and imagination wrapped up in one. It is to ponder the actual. When you have models of liberation that you are able to preserve, you're able to honestly ponder the actual right now. What is the country like? What is actually happening? What is faith actually like? But then when we have that memory and those models, we're able to imagine the possible. What can we become? And how can we put that into daily practice? How can we come from a tradition, criticize the tradition, and expand it? Yeah. That is a part of renewing our mind and renewing our spirit and renewing our soul, is to ponder the actual and imagine the possible. And if we can do those two things, I think we can give better models for now and the future that we hope for ourselves.
I'm going to go collect a few extra saints to put around me. So as we get close to the end, I'm wondering is there something, a small sample of something new that you're working on you'd like to share with us? Or
yeah, I have a few things that I've been rolling around in my head lately. I've really been thinking about, honestly, I've really been thinking about, like, what does it mean to, like, notice and look at the world and be in this world and grieve the world and make something of it. So I've been working on my next book on grief. So I'll give you a little bit of of this book, just a tad bit. I'll give you a tad bit of this.
Thank you.
So, all right. What is the word when you feel like you have one, but you actually don't? I speak a lot in public about liberation. In my book, Shoutin' in the Fire, the word liberation appears 37 times. The dedication reads, for Jasmine, Asa, and Ava, and all who dream of love and liberation. This is addressed to my wife and my son and my daughter. My desk is full of books that speak the same language back to me. Over my shoulder, there are 4 images that watch, and in my mind's imagination, pray over me. Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, James Cone, Katie Cannon. As my eyes travel back from the books that weigh down my desk to my coffee, and then to the reflections of those 4 images in the black side of my computer screen, I remind myself, love is the beginning of liberation, and liberation is the embodiment of love. I've forced myself to believe that sentence. I've also had to slow down the pace at which I've been living. You have to grieve. A friend told me as she spoke about a recent loss we both experienced. This was not the type of loss and absence that emerges after death. It was about the type of loss that is felt as a song shifts. It was the loss of what was familiar, a sort of disillusionment and distance between what was before and what is now. She said to me that I must give myself room to feel what it means to lose a friend, 2 aunts, and a grandfather in the space of 4 months. And then I have to give myself to grieve what also died when I made the decision to change and grow. The losses were different, but the trauma, all the same. Some find facing loss and fear distasteful. Some find it energizing and exciting. I find it both to be true at the same time, and that the experience of anxiety and grief chooses which word would be ours in any given moment. You have to grieve, she said, the person you are and the person other people remember. I think my profound love for James Baldwin exists partly because he had the courage to reinvent himself, and others, because of his Blackness and sexuality, refused to allow him to hold the full range of human complexity. I never thought about the word liberation until I read him, and I don't think he ever even used that word much. Baldwin always spoke about the new world, the new Jerusalem, something familiar but unfamiliar, something that feels like dancing but also like living. Liberation is as much about self-love and self-reinvention as it is about power. As a child, I remember my mother every weekday in the early mornings, walking silently in the room to each of our hot rooms, moving her lips in a silent whisper. She was praying. She knew the lay of the South Carolina land and how much grief it holds. Soil where I'm from makes it hard to plant crops. My father spent countless hours in the cool, brisk, chill mornings planting seeds in the brown dirt of Swansea, South Carolina, and nothing ever grew of it. I asked my father if he had any regrets over the land's refusing the gifts of the hands of a dreamer. No, he told me over the phone. You can't live life with regrets. When he said that, I knew my mother never regretted praying over us. And then I understood a little bit more about James Baldwin as I read the chronology and why his seclusion and exhaustion were sandwiched between the devil found work and he begins teaching and his expanded version of the evidence of things not seen. It is not that our actions will always yield the desired results. Sometimes we fail. Sometimes the earth failed us. But the very act of throwing seeds means that we care enough about ourselves and those around us to give us something that keeps us going. I am far removed from those early morning rooms and that warm dirt. But I imagine that being liberated is about staying tapped into our humanity, a willingness to be involved in something deeper, something that reminds us again and again that even if words fail, our present doesn't. It's difficult to see what we see and endure what we are forced to endure. But it is also beautiful to be who we are and to know that something else is waiting for us.
Danté, that's beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Neil, for a great interview as always. Danté, we are excited for you. We're glad you're on this end of the flu and not just beginning it. I could hear it. I could hear it in your voice. I was hoping you were towards the end of it. So continue to feel better. Best wishes to you and blessings upon your words and your work and your presence in this world. And so thank you. And thanks everybody for being a part of this evening. And we hope you have a great rest of the evening. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye.